I'm Alice Ancona, Senior VP and COO of the World Trade Center Miami. The World Trade Center Miami has served as Miami's platform for international trade since 1986. We actively work to grow two-way trade and support small and medium-sized businesses by connecting them to the global marketplace. I'd like to take this opportunity to recognize our production team, Patrick Misewicz and Yendi Alvarez. Thank you so much for your support on this video series. And thank you everyone for joining us. Today we're going to talk about the situation in Belarus. Belarus has a population of 9.5 million. It borders Russia to the east and Ukraine to the south. To the north and the west are EU and NATO members, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland. Since the August 9th disputed general elections, tens of thousands have been protesting and striking in Belarus. Europe's longest serving ruler, President Lukashenko, has been in charge of Belarus for 26 years and was recently re-elected during this controversial election. Alexander Lukashenko has often been described as Europe's last dictator and has tried to preserve elements of Soviet communism. Now there's a huge opposition movement demanding new democratic leadership and economic reform. Here to talk to us today about the situation in Belarus is David Kramer, Senior Fellow at Florida International University's Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs. David has previously worked as Senior Director of Human Rights and Democracy at the McCain Institute for International Leadership. He served as President of the Freedom House. He was Senior Transatlantic Fellow at the German Marshall Fund. He served 8 years in the U.S. Department of State, including as Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, and as Deputy Assistant Secretary for European and Eurasian Affairs. He has held various other roles during his time in Washington. Welcome, David, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks very much, Alice. Pleasure to be with you.
To begin, while I gave a very brief overview of what's happening in Belarus, it would be helpful to give our audience for you to go deeper and describe the current situation, and most importantly, why does this matter?
Sure. Well, the country of Belarus held a presidential election on August 9th, and this is the latest in Alexander Lukashenko's efforts to stay in power. As you said, he's been in power for 26 years, and he essentially rigged this election on August 9th. He first disqualified several candidates who tried to register to run against him. And in the process, the wife of one of those who had been denied registration, and her husband actually was also arrested, she decided to register to run against Lukashenko. And for whatever reason, perhaps because Lukashenko is a misogynist, he's thinking that a woman has no chance against him, he agreed to register Svetlana Tsikhanovskaya. And she had an amazing campaign. There were thousands of people who turned out for her campaign events, and there were two other women who joined her, so it was almost a trio of three Belarusian women who were campaigning against Lukashenko. Then on August 9th, after Lukashenko did everything he could to prepare things ahead of time, the Central Election Commission announced he won with 80% of the vote. No one thinks this is true. In fact, there are serious indications that Tsikhanovskaya actually won the election with a majority of the vote. And instead, she was denied that victory. She then was called in by the authorities and then forced out of the country to neighboring Lithuania. Lukashenko then launched a nasty, ugly crackdown against people who turned out in the streets protesting his latest effort to rig an election. This is not the first time he's done so, by the way. After the election in 2006, there were crowds who turned out and he cracked down then. In 2010, the same thing. This time, however, the use of force was much more brutal, much more widespread. Nearly 7,000 people who were protesting peacefully were rounded up by the authorities and thrown in jail. And so we are now approaching roughly 3 weeks since that election. And the situation is very fluid. It's very fragile. There's the concern about possible Russian intervention of some sort. And Belarus matters, as you said, because of its geographic location between Russia and NATO and EU countries. It's also been a place where there has been lots of travel back and forth going back for centuries. And so Belarus is a country where this latest democratic move, this push demanding better from their leaders, demanding a better future for their country, this is something I think the West should get behind. I think also for your viewers in South Florida, it's important to understand that Lukashenko has been a staunch ally of Hugo Chavez, of Nicolas Maduro, of the Castros. So this is the kind of company he keeps along with Vladimir Putin. And so if Lukashenko were to be pushed out of power as a result of a popular movement demanding better for the country, a democratic movement, who knows what messages others could infer from that and what other possible movements we could see around the world.
Thank you for that. Aside from, just what's going on, economically and what their desire for change is, how are these protests different from the ones from prior years? What makes this much more, I guess, emotional, pivotal, much more meaningful in terms of what's going on from the protesters?
The size and scale of these protests are unprecedented. Belarus has not seen anything on this scale before. In Minsk, the Sunday after the election, a week after the election, there were some 250,000 people who turned out in the center of Minsk. And there were other protests throughout the country. And more recently, there was a protest of some 150,000. And keep in mind, these people are turning out despite the fact that the authorities are rounding up people rather randomly, throwing them in jail. There have been videos that have come out of people who were subsequently released showing vicious, brutal beatings and torture that these people endured, with bodies badly bruised, bones broken. And this has stirred additional outrage. The level of violence is also unprecedented. We've seen violence in the past. I don't want to suggest 2006 and 2010 were without problems and protests, but the scale here is much, much bigger. Another factor to keep in mind is people are just fed up with 26 years of Alexander Lukashenko, his corrupt authoritarian leadership. Making matters worse was his attitude toward the coronavirus pandemic, which has affected Belarus quite significantly. And Lukashenko was very dismissive of this, that it wasn't a problem. And his prescription for people to deal with it was to drive a tractor, to take a long sauna, and to drink vodka. Needless to say, none of those things is going to work. And so people were very upset with his negligent leadership on this major issue that was facing the country. And they also, I think, simply decided if other countries can move in a democratic direction, why can't we? So they decided, the voters, when they went to vote August 9th, decided time is up for Mr. Lukashenko.
And perhaps to kind of levy on that, I can imagine that, COVID has certainly had a strong economic impact globally. And right now, obviously a place like Belarus is certainly being impacted in a certain way. And these protests are contributing to, this need for change or this desire for change. What do you think are the implications of this change for the region? I mean, Belarus is in a very interesting location. It borders Russia. It's right smack in the EU. We're neighboring NATO countries. Would any of those have influential factors on what's going on? I think in some of the news, there's been allegations of external influence, but what do you think are the implications for change for the region?
Well, it's a situation where Belarus has had historically close ties with Russia. In 1999, Lukashenko, he was 5 years into his presidency, and then Russian President Boris Yeltsin signed a union state agreement. It hasn't been fully implemented, but it's an indication that the two countries look to each other for very close ties. There are a lot of cultural, historical, linguistic, family ties between the two countries. And it's very important to keep in mind that these protests have not been about Russia. They haven't been about the European Union. They haven't been about NATO. It is not pro-Western. It's not anti-Russian. It's pro-Belarus. So the people that are turning out in the streets are calling for a better future for their country. They're not trying to get involved in some geopolitical struggle or competition between Russia on the one side and NATO and the EU on the other. That said, Lukashenko quite recently has been talking about NATO building up its forces along the Polish and Lithuanian border with Belarus. Simply not true. We have seen, however, from the Russian side, planes arriving from St. Petersburg and Moscow into Minsk, bringing people who were filling in for TV presenters on state TV in Belarus who have resigned out of principle. They are now filling those slots on state TV. We've seen members of Russia's FSB, the successor agency of the KGB, which, by the way, Lukashenko still calls his security forces the KGB. And so we are seeing an infiltration of and a penetration of Russian forces in here. Russia arguably is the most influential outside player in this. And on Thursday, August 27th, Putin announced that he was preparing an additional law enforcement battalion should it be necessary, should the protests in Belarus get out of control. I hope that that won't be appearing in Belarus anytime soon. I certainly hope there won't be any tanks crossing the border. The challenge Russia faces right now is Putin doesn't like to see like-minded leaders fall from power, particularly driven as a result of popular movements. He doesn't like it in Syria, and that's why he intervened there to prop up Bashar al-Assad. He didn't like it in other parts of the Arab world in 2011. He certainly didn't like it in Ukraine in 2014 with Viktor Yanukovych, and he doesn't like it in Belarus, even though he also doesn't like Alexander Lukashenko. It's well known that the two leaders, Putin and Lukashenko, don't get along. At the same time, because these protests have not been about Russia, either anti or pro, Russia runs the risk, if it intervenes or is being seen as propping up Lukashenko, to turn these protests into anti-Russia. And so that's, I think, a very difficult issue and dilemma for Moscow to sort out. It doesn't want to see Lukashenko fall. That's in Putin's interest to keep him there. But at the same time, it doesn't want to turn a country that has been generally favorably disposed toward Russia against Russia as a result of an invasion or some other kind of interference in what's happening there.
And building a little bit on that, I think it might be worth explaining a bit the economic relationship between Russia and Belarus. I know it's changed a little bit in recent history, but you know that there's significant ties economically between Belarus and Russia that are important considerations going forward.
There are, and Lukashenko has actually increased those ties over the years, although you're right that Russia has cut back on the subsidies that it has been provided to Belarus. Russia had been exporting oil and other energy products, which Belarus would then turn around and produce and export to other parts of Europe. And so the Russia-Belarus economic relationship has been a very important one. Lukashenko has actually increased Belarus's dependence on Russia over the years rather than reduced it. Lukashenko has also increased the role of the state in the economy, where it's about 75% state-run in the economy with very little private market economy, though there is some. And as a result, Lukashenko has also looked to Russia when he has been sanctioned by the West in the past. I mentioned the 2006 elections and the aftermath of the 2010 elections. Both the European Union and the United States responded to the problems with those two elections with sanctions. And the reaction of Putin was to turn to Russia in the face of those sanctions to look for help and support when the Western option was being closed off to him. The problem also has been that Lukashenko loves to play Russia and the West off of each other. And we have largely fallen for it. There was a desire in Europe in particular, but also even in the United States, to try to normalize the relationship with Lukashenko starting around 2015, 2016. It included a visit last August by then National Security Advisor John Bolton, the highest level visit to Belarus in many years. And then Secretary of State Mike Pompeo visited Lukashenko on February 1st, and you can look up the video of it. He's shaking hands, smiling, laughing. Not a video that stands up terribly well right now, frankly. And so there was this effort, though, to try to normalize, because the EU and the United States were looking at Belarus from a geopolitical perspective, looking the other way over the human rights problems in the country. And now we're seeing that that probably was a mistake on the part of the West.
Building a little bit on that, I think we saw in the news, just kind of everyone kind of stepped back on getting involved. I think there's been kind of warning shots from both Russia, don't get involved, to the EU. And the EU seemed to just issue minor sanctions to individuals, but maybe you can talk a little bit about what the EU's role is going to be. I think coronavirus has certainly been kind of an overwhelming situation for everyone, so the EU certainly has its hands tied with its just dealing with coronavirus and what's going on economically, that the situation in Belarus might not be priority, but it certainly has implications for the region. So what do you see the role of the EU going forward, and what's going on in Belarus and its neighboring Baltic states?
Well, there was an EU official who made, I think, a very unfortunate statement saying Belarus is not part of Europe. It's a country between Europe and Russia. And it's just geographically not true, but it's also politically a stupid thing to say. Belarus is part of Europe. And the EU, therefore, does have an extra responsibility and obligation to step up and try to help the protesters in Belarus. The EU did announce that it did not recognize and accept the results of August 9th. So the EU took the right position there, although it took them about 10 days to make that statement. They have said they're planning to move ahead with sanctions. They actually have not yet. They are the ones who lifted all the sanctions back in 2015 and 16. The United States kept a few sanctions in place, including against Lukashenko. But the United States also needs to do more, I would argue, not just the EU. Secretary of State Pompeo, the day after the election, issued a statement in which he described the election as neither free nor fair. But at the same time, he hasn't said much since then. He gave a speech in Prague later that week talking about democracy, and he didn't mention Belarus. He tried to clean that up later in some interviews by talking about Belarus. We just had the Deputy Secretary of State, Steve Biegun, a very solid person, expert on Eurasia, in the region, going to Lithuania, meeting with the opposition leader, Tsikhanouskaya. He then went on to Moscow. We don't have a full readout on what happened on his trip, but that at least is an indication. I think it's come late, but better late than never, that the United States is trying to do more and engage and figure out how to do this. The West is in a bit of a tricky situation because it wants to stand with the people of Belarus who are fighting for democracy, and that's something we should always do. At the same time, it wants to avoid the appearance that might be perceived in Moscow as provoking. It's trying to drag Belarus toward the West, and that in turn might elicit a reaction from Moscow. So the EU and the United States are trying to walk a very fine line here, but I think they may be a little too conservative and cautious in their approach and should be more supportive of what the people of Belarus are trying to bring about in their country.
And maybe a hypothetical here, but going a little bit further, should there be, a stronger push, democratic push within Belarus, and should the EU or even the US want to get involved, what would that mean for relations with Russia, overall? How would this, play out, so to speak, even though obviously this is a big hypothetical here, but just wondering what that might look like and what would Russia's role be?
I actually think that there is a scenario, it may be very unlikely, but I think there is a scenario where everyone could be at peace. And that would involve the EU, US, and Russia recognizing that the people of Belarus want Lukashenko out. And if Russia worked on that and even provided safe haven for Lukashenko so that he would leave power and leave the country, I actually think that would engender goodwill among Belarusians toward Russia. I think it would also redound to the benefit of the EU and the United States, but most importantly, it would work to the advantage of the people of Belarus. They want him gone. And so I hope Russia recognizes that there actually is a scenario in which it could possibly even enhance its position and influence in Belarus by playing a constructive role in facilitating Lukashenko's departure. I'm not predicting that's going to happen. That would take a rather enlightened approach in Moscow these days that I think we don't see very often. But again, I think the EU and the United States should reinforce to Moscow that any move militarily into Belarus or any real overt efforts to prop up Lukashenko would be met with a stern response, because it would be yet another violation by Putin of a neighboring country's sovereignty, territorial integrity, and independence. And that's something that we should make clear we will not tolerate or accept.
Yeah, historically, I think that situation happened with the Ukraine and Russia then moving on Crimea. I think that's always been kind of a fear of maybe Russia might just do something, but everything changes. So we're all treading carefully. But, in talking about Russia, perhaps it's worth also not just the EU generically, but maybe the larger players within the EU, like Germany and France, Any movement from them on what's going on here in the region and any concerns from their end?
Well, Chancellor Merkel apparently did try to reach Lukashenko several times by phone, and he apparently refused to take her call. President Macron in France has been pushing for a re-engagement policy with Russia. I think any move by Moscow and Putin into Belarus should kill any prospect of that. Both France and Germany, I think, can and should be playing a stronger role. Germany, to be fair, has just taken in Alexei Navalny, the Russian opposition leader who was poisoned on a flight from Siberia. So Germany has stepped up and played, I think, a very important role in providing potentially life-saving support to Navalny. That can't be sitting too well in Moscow these days, particularly where German authorities have announced that Navalny was poisoned, something that the Kremlin has rejected. So Germany is dealing with that issue. But at the same time, Germany and France, and frankly, the UK, and even though it's moving out of the EU, all these countries should recognize that a democratic Belarus is in their interest. We have seen Lithuania, tiny country, member of the EU and NATO, a Baltic state, really stepping up and pushing for a stronger policy from the EU. Lithuania, of course, received Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, which is not an easy thing to do because then Lithuania becomes the target of both Lukashenko and Putin. And we've also seen Poland step up and press for stronger support for the people of Belarus. So what we have, I think, unfortunately, is a bit of a differentiated policy. I would like to see Germany and France and other countries in the EU join the Lithuanians and the Poles in particular in stronger support for what's happening on the streets of Minsk.
And I guess a more general question in terms of the future of democracy, and especially a fragile democracy like this, like Belarus, with COVID-19, with a global economic recession. What is the future of democracy for these fragile democracies? And we see that, we had an earlier conversation about what's going on in Latin America. We certainly know that global recessions, tend to impact political situations back home. What is your thinking on what could happen with what is the future of democracy?
Well, I go back to my previous organization, Freedom House, which every year ranks countries based on how they're doing on political rights and civil liberties. And since 2006, Freedom House has been tracking a decline in freedom around the world. So this even predates the recession that we had in 2008 and more recent economic troubles. It hasn't been a precipitous decline, but it has been a decline where more countries are registering drops on political rights and civil liberties than they are gains. And what we have been seeing now in light of the pandemic, The Economist estimated that some 84, 85 parliaments granted the executive branches in their countries more powers to deal with a public health crisis. That's on the one hand understandable, but on the other hand, it runs the risk that these executive branches will not return this power that they have been given to deal with a public health issue. And so I think that there are countries that are taking the right steps out of a public health interest. There are other governments and leaders who are exploiting this situation in order to enhance their powers, make sure the opposition doesn't come to power, to go after critics, go after journalists. And you see, and this again is understandable from a public health perspective, restrictions on freedom of assembly, freedom of association, but even some freedom of speech, where some governments will determine what is fake news or disinformation that could threaten public health, but that definition is so broadly interpreted it can be used against anyone who might criticize the actions of the government. So we're facing, I think, some real challenges here. That said, and maybe to end on a positive note, we are seeing people around the world still going out and demanding freedom. We saw it in Algeria last year. We saw it in Sudan, of all places, We have seen it in Hong Kong, despite the tremendous pressure from the Communist Party cracking down and imposing the national security law there. We see incredibly brave people turning out in the streets against serious threats to their well-being and health and even their freedom. And of course, as we've been discussing here today, we've seen it in Belarus. So to me, that's always a source of inspiration and hope that the desire to live in freedom is unquenchable. And people won't be deterred, but they may have to wait for just the right moment. And the election on August 9th in Belarus, I think for many people in that country, provided that right moment. And so it seems to me it's incumbent upon us in the United States and Europe and elsewhere where we do have democratic systems of government, which aren't perfect, but we shouldn't take these things for granted because there are other people around the world making enormous sacrifices in order to try to live the free life that we sometimes take for granted here.
Thank you for that, David. And certainly, the future of democracy is a larger conversation, which we hope to cover throughout our conversation series here at the World Trade Center. We're firmly committed to promoting free trade, which is tied to democratic systems. And for the success of trade, it does require free government and democracies to be both strong and successful internally. So thank you for that. And we certainly appreciate your time with us today. Thanks you for joining us. And thank you everyone for listening in.